There is one additional clause, the attorney said, and the smile on my daughter-in-law's face disappeared so quickly that I almost missed it. Until that moment, everyone in the room believed they already knew how the story would end. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 72 years old, and 3 weeks before that meeting, I buried my husband of 47 years. Thomas had been my best friend since I was 19. We built a life together in a small Ohio town, raised a son, paid off a mortgage, planted trees in our backyard, and dreamed about growing old together. We got the growing old part. We just didn't get as much time as we thought. The conference room felt colder than it should have that afternoon. A long polished table sat beneath bright overhead lights. A pitcher of water stood untouched in the center. The attorney, Benjamin Foster, organized his documents with careful precision. Across from me sat my son Ryan and his wife Nicole. Ryan looked impatient. Nicole looked confident. That confidence caught my attention. Most families arrive at a will reading with mixed emotions. Grief, uncertainty, reflection. Nicole looked like someone waiting to collect a prize. I folded my hands quietly in my lap. Since Thomas passed away, I had learned that silence revealed more than questions ever could. People showed you who they were when they believed you had no power left. 3 weeks earlier, our church had been filled with friends and neighbors paying their respects. The funeral was beautiful. Thomas would have appreciated its simplicity. Fresh white flowers, old hymns, familiar faces. I remember standing beside his casket feeling as though half the world had gone quiet. For days afterward, I wandered through our home, unable to adjust to the absence. His coffee mug still sat beside the sink. His reading glasses remained on the end table next to his favorite chair. His gardening gloves hung neatly in the garage exactly where he had left them. Every room carried traces of him. Every room reminded me he was gone. During those first few days, Ryan called often. He sounded concerned, caring, even. But something changed quickly. The phone calls became conversations. About practical matters. The house. The accounts. The future. Nicole began accompanying him on every visit. At first, I told myself it was kindness. Then I noticed small things. She measured rooms with her eyes. She asked questions about renovations. She talked about property values. One afternoon, she stood in my kitchen and casually mentioned how much young families would love a house this size. I remember looking at her while she smiled into her coffee cup. The comment stayed with me long after she left. A week later, Ryan brought up the possibility of downsizing. He spoke carefully, choosing his words as if rehearsing them beforehand. He said the house might become difficult for me to manage alone. He suggested a retirement community nearby, somewhere with activities, somewhere with less responsibility, somewhere smaller. I nodded and listened. The conversation felt strange because Thomas and I had never discussed leaving this house. Not once. We loved this place. We had spent 35 years turning it into a home. Every floorboard carried memories. Every wall held photographs of birthdays, graduations, holidays, and ordinary Tuesdays that somehow became precious with time. Yet Ryan spoke as though my departure was already decided. Nicole sat beside him quietly, but I noticed the look they exchanged when they thought I wasn't paying attention. It wasn't concern. It was expectation. The following Sunday, they arrived for dinner. The atmosphere felt different. Ryan talked about future plans. Nicole discussed schools she liked. Neither of them lived in our neighborhood. Neither of them had any reason to mention local schools. Yet there they were, discussing them in my dining room. I listened. I smiled when appropriate. And for the first time, I felt like a guest in my own home. Then came the call from Benjamin Foster. Thomas had updated several estate documents before his passing. The attorney wanted everyone present for the formal reading. Ryan seemed eager when I told him. Nicole seemed even more eager. That alone told me more than either of them realized. Which is why I sat quietly in that conference room now, watching, listening, waiting. Benjamin cleared his throat and began reading. The process took nearly an hour. Family assets, investments, property details, trust arrangements. Ryan grew increasingly relaxed as the meeting progressed. Nicole's smile widened. They exchanged several satisfied glances. By the time Benjamin reached the final pages, they looked convinced everything was unfolding exactly as they expected. Then Benjamin stopped. He adjusted his glasses. He opened a separate folder. The room became very still. Before we conclude, he said calmly, there is one additional clause that Thomas Carter personally instructed me to present. Nicole's smile froze. Ryan frowned. And for the first time since my husband's funeral, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Not relief. Not happiness. Just the quiet feeling that Thomas might still be protecting me from beyond the plans everyone else thought they understood. Benjamin Foster did not read the clause immediately. Instead, he closed the folder and looked around the room as though measuring every reaction before speaking. Ryan shifted in his chair. Nicole leaned forward slightly. I remained still. Years of marriage had taught me that silence often revealed more than conversation. The conference room suddenly felt smaller. Outside the large window behind Benjamin, a gray Ohio afternoon stretched across the parking lot. Cars came and went. Ordinary people continued with ordinary lives. Meanwhile, something important was unfolding inside that room. Before I continue, Benjamin said, I think it would be helpful to provide some context regarding Thomas's final instructions. Nicole's expression tightened. She clearly wanted the meeting over. She clearly believed she already knew the outcome. Ryan glanced toward her before looking back at the attorney. That glance did not escape me. Since Thomas passed away, I had noticed how often my son looked to his wife before speaking, before answering questions, before expressing opinions. It was subtle, but once I saw it, I could not stop seeing it. Benjamin opened another document. Thomas met with me several times during the last year, he explained. He reviewed every aspect of his estate. Personally, Nicole folded her arms. Ryan frowned. Why does that matter? He asked. Benjamin ignored the interruption and continued. Your father was extremely thorough. I lowered my eyes briefly. That description made me smile inside. Thorough was exactly the right word. Thomas never rushed anything. Whether he was repairing a fence, balancing a checkbook, or planting tomatoes in the backyard, he believed details mattered, especially details other people overlooked. The meeting ended shortly afterward with Benjamin scheduling a follow-up appointment for the following week. Whatever the clause contained, he was not prepared to discuss it that day. Nicole seemed frustrated by that decision. Ryan looked confused. I said very little. On the drive home, rain tapped softly against my windshield. The roads were nearly empty. I passed familiar stores, familiar neighborhoods, familiar intersections that Thomas and I had traveled together for decades. Everything looked the same. Yet nothing felt the same anymore. When I pulled into the driveway, the house greeted me with the same quiet that had become my constant companion. The maple tree Thomas planted 20 years earlier stood beside the front walk. The porch swing remained exactly where he had left it. The flower beds needed attention. He would have noticed that immediately. He always noticed things. I stepped inside and set my purse on the kitchen counter. The silence wrapped around me. At first, after the funeral, that silence felt unbearable. Now it felt different. Not comforting. Not painful. Just honest. The house did not pretend anything. It did not offer false sympathy. It simply existed, carrying decades of memories within its walls. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. Across from me stood the empty chair Thomas had occupied every morning for years. I could almost picture him there, reading the newspaper and making comments about local politics. Sometimes grief arrived like a wave. Other times it arrived through ordinary details like an empty chair. I stared out the window and thought about the weeks following his passing. The changes had started almost immediately. Ryan began visiting more often than usual. At first, I appreciated it. A grieving mother wants to believe her child is showing concern. But gradually the conversation shifted. He asked questions about account statements, insurance paperwork, property taxes, home maintenance expenses. Then came discussions about the future. My future. Their future. The house. Looking back, I realized something important. Nobody ever asked what I wanted. They simply discussed possibilities as though decisions had already been made. One afternoon, Nicole stood in the living room, studying the fireplace. This room could be beautiful with some updates, she said casually. At the time, I pretended not to notice. Now I remembered every word. Another day, she commented on how much larger this house was than their current place. Another day, she mentioned rising property values in our neighborhood. Small comments. Harmless comments. Yet together they formed a pattern. The realization settled heavily over me. Ryan and Nicole had not been imagining a future for me. They had been imagining a future for themselves. I carried my coffee into the living room and sat beside the window. Evening shadows stretched across the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed. The neighborhood continued its routine. I thought about Benjamin's expression when he mentioned Thomas's final instructions. I thought about the separate folder. I thought about the clause. Most of all, I thought about my husband. Thomas had known people better than they realized. He rarely judged, rarely criticized, but he observed everything. If he had added something special to his estate plan, there was a reason. As darkness settled outside, I looked toward the hallway leading to our bedroom. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than grief. It was not certainty. It was not hope. It was simply the quiet suspicion that Thomas had seen this coming long before any of us did. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For nearly 5 decades, Thomas had been the first person awake in our house. He would start the coffee, open the kitchen blinds, and check the weather before I even came downstairs. Now the kitchen was dark when I entered. The coffee maker was silent. The chair across from mine remained empty. I poured myself a cup and stood by the window watching the sky slowly brighten over the neighborhood. Everything appeared normal. A delivery truck rolled past. A neighbor walked his dog. Sprinklers clicked on across the street. Yet beneath that ordinary morning, something felt unsettled. I could not stop thinking about the clause. More importantly, I could not stop thinking about why Thomas had created it. Around noon, Ryan called. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. He asked how I was doing and whether I needed anything from the grocery store. The sudden concern felt strange. For weeks, our conversations had revolved around paperwork and future plans. Now he sounded almost overly friendly. I thanked him and told him I was fine. Then there was a pause. A small one. The kind that reveals the real reason for a call. Finally, he asked, "Did Benjamin say anything else after the meeting?" I looked out the window before answering. "No," I said calmly. "Nothing important." Another pause followed. "Well," Ryan said, "I am sure everything will be straightforward." Straightforward. The word lingered in my mind long after the call ended. That afternoon, I decided to visit the cemetery. Thomas always found peace there when visiting his parents. He used to say cemeteries reminded people what truly mattered. Not money, not property, not status, just how we treated one another while we had the chance. I carried fresh flowers and stood quietly beside his headstone. The spring breeze moved through the trees overhead. I found myself talking to him as though he were standing beside me. I told him about the meeting, about Ryan, about Nicole, about the feeling that something was unfolding beyond my understanding. Standing there, I remembered a conversation from nearly a year earlier. We had been sitting on our back porch after dinner. Thomas had looked unusually thoughtful. He asked me a question that seemed odd at the time. "If something happens to me," he said, "promise you will never let anyone pressure you into decisions you do not want to make." I laughed then and told him he was worrying too much. He did not laugh back. He simply nodded and stared across the yard. At the time, I thought he was talking about grief. Now I wondered if he had been talking about something else entirely. 2 days later, another strange thing happened. Ryan and Nicole stopped by unexpectedly. Nicole carried a folder. She sat at my dining room table and spread out several brochures. Retirement communities, independent living centers, senior housing developments. She smiled warmly while describing amenities and social activities. Swimming pools, clubhouses, fitness classes, organized trips. She spoke as though she were presenting an exciting opportunity. Ryan remained unusually quiet. I listened politely. Then Nicole pointed to one brochure. "This one has a waiting list," she said. "If you decide soon, you could reserve a unit before they are all gone." Decide soon. There it was again. The assumption that a decision had already been made. I closed the brochure and slid it gently back across the table. "I am not planning to move," I said. The room became very quiet. Nicole blinked. Ryan looked down at his hands. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Nicole forced a smile. "Of course," she said. "We just wanted you to know your options." After they left, I stood alone in the dining room. The brochures remained on the table. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating photographs that covered the nearby wall. Birthdays, anniversaries, family vacations, decades of memories. My eyes settled on a picture taken 15 years earlier. Thomas stood between Ryan and me, smiling proudly. Looking at that photograph, I suddenly understood something that chilled me more than anything Nicole had said. Ryan and Nicole were not waiting to see what the clause contained. They were waiting for access to a future they believed already belonged to them. And somehow, deep down, I was beginning to suspect that Thomas had known exactly that. That evening, I climbed the stairs to the bedroom Thomas and I had shared for nearly half a century. The room looked exactly as it had the day he left for the hospital. His watch sat on the dresser. His favorite hardcover novel rested on the nightstand with a bookmark still tucked between the pages. For weeks, I had avoided touching any of it. Somehow, moving those objects felt too final. But that night, something urged me to look more closely. I opened the top drawer of his dresser and found neatly organized documents, old receipts, warranty cards, and handwritten notes in his familiar block lettering. Thomas had always believed important things should be written down. As I sorted through the papers, memories returned one after another. I remembered how carefully he managed our finances. I remembered how often he reviewed account statements after Ryan and Nicole got married. At the time, I thought he was simply becoming more cautious with age. Now I was beginning to wonder if there had been another reason. Near the back of the drawer, I found a small notebook. It was one I had seen him use during his final year. The cover was worn. Several pages were filled with reminders about household projects and appointments. Then I noticed an entry dated 8 months before his passing. Beneath a list of ordinary errands, Thomas had written a single sentence. Protect Evelyn first. Everything else comes second. I stared at those words for a long moment. My throat tightened. Thomas had never been dramatic. He was not the kind of man who wrote emotional speeches or grand declarations. When he wrote something down, it mattered. I carefully closed the notebook and placed it beside me on the bed. The next morning, I called Benjamin Foster. I did not ask about the clause directly. I knew he would not discuss legal matters before the scheduled meeting. Instead, I asked a simple question. Was Thomas worried about something? There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Your husband was very thoughtful, Benjamin finally replied. He spent a great deal of time making sure his wishes were clear. It was not a direct answer. Yet somehow it told me everything I needed to know. Later that afternoon, I drove to the local garden center. Gardening had always helped me think. Thomas and I spent years building flower beds around the property. Working with soil reminded me that growth required patience. As I loaded a few plants into my cart, I heard someone call my name. I turned and saw Grace Holloway. She had worked with Thomas for more than 20 years at the manufacturing company where he spent most of his career. Grace was in her late 60s, sharp-minded, and impossible to intimidate. We exchanged a warm greeting. Then something in her expression changed. How are you really doing? She asked quietly. Most people had stopped asking that question weeks ago. Most people assumed grief followed a schedule. I told her I was managing. She nodded slowly. Thomas talked about you often, she said, especially during the last year. My attention sharpened immediately. What do you mean? I asked. Grace hesitated. It was the hesitation that caught my attention. She looked around the garden center before lowering her voice. Your husband was paying attention to things, she said, more than people realized. Before I could ask another question, a customer approached her from across the aisle. Grace glanced at her watch. I need to run, she said, but perhaps we should have coffee sometime soon. Then she handed me a business card and walked away. I stood there holding the card long after she disappeared around the corner. That evening, I sat on the back porch watching the sun sink behind the trees. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass. Somewhere nearby, children laughed as they played in a neighboring yard. I thought about Thomas. I thought about Grace. I thought about the notebook hidden in the dresser drawer. Piece by piece, a picture was beginning to form. Not a complete picture. Not yet. But enough to convince me that my husband had been preparing for something long before any of us understood why. And as darkness settled over the yard, I found myself waiting less for the reading of the clause and more for the truth that seemed to be moving steadily toward me. 3 days later, I met Grace Holloway at a small coffee shop on the edge of town. It was the kind of place Thomas loved. Nothing fancy, just good coffee, quiet conversations, and familiar faces. Rain tapped gently against the windows as I arrived. Grace was already seated in a corner booth with 2 cups, waiting on the table. When I sat down, she studied me for a moment before speaking. You look stronger than the last time I saw you, she said. I smiled faintly. I am not sure if I am stronger or simply paying closer attention. Grace nodded as though she understood exactly what I meant. For a few minutes we talked about ordinary things. The weather, retirement, mutual friends. Then she placed her coffee cup down carefully and looked directly at me. Thomas knew something was wrong, she said. The words landed heavily between us. I felt my pulse quicken. What do you mean? I asked quietly. Grace folded her hands together. About a year ago, he started asking unusual questions. Not business questions. Family questions. I listened without interrupting. At first, I thought he was simply updating his estate plan, she continued. But eventually I realized he was trying to understand how certain people behaved when they thought nobody was watching. My stomach tightened. Grace reached into her purse and removed a small envelope. She slid it across the table. He asked me to keep this if anything happened to him before certain documents were finalized. I stared at the envelope. My name was written across the front in Thomas's handwriting. Seeing those familiar letters nearly took my breath away. Why did he not give it to me himself? I asked. Grace looked down briefly. I think he hoped he would have more time. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a folded note. The paper trembled slightly in my hands as I unfolded it. Thomas's handwriting filled the page. It was short. Very short. That was his way. He never wasted words. Evelyn, if you are reading this, trust your instincts. Do not allow guilt to make decisions for you. People reveal their true intentions when they believe the outcome is guaranteed. Watch carefully. The truth will become obvious. Love always, Thomas. I read the note twice. Then a third time. By the time I finished, I understood why Grace had wanted to meet in person. This was not simply a message. It was a warning. Grace waited patiently while I gathered myself. There is more, she finally said. I looked up. Thomas visited Benjamin Foster several times during his final months. More than most people realized. He was concerned about protecting you. I remembered the notebook entry. Protect Evelyn first. Everything else comes second. Suddenly those words carried greater weight. Did he tell you why? I asked. Grace hesitated. Not directly. But one afternoon, he mentioned overhearing a conversation. My attention sharpened immediately. A conversation? Grace nodded. He never shared every detail. He was not that kind of man. But he told me he heard Ryan and Nicole discussing future plans that seemed unusually focused on assets rather than family. I sat silently. Outside, rain continued to fall against the glass. Cars passed through the parking lot. Nobody around us seemed aware that my understanding of the past year was changing by the minute. Thomas was disappointed, Grace said softly. Not angry, just disappointed. Somehow that hurt more. Thomas loved Ryan deeply. He always had. Even during disagreements. Even during difficult years. The thought of him carrying that disappointment alone made my chest ache. Grace leaned forward slightly. Whatever is in that clause, Evelyn, I believe he created it because he wanted to make sure nobody could pressure you after he was gone. The words echoed thoughts I had already begun forming myself. For weeks I had questioned my instincts, questioned my suspicions, questioned whether grief was making me imagine things. Now those doubts were fading. Piece by piece, evidence was replacing uncertainty. When we finally left the coffee shop, the rain had stopped. Gray clouds were beginning to break apart overhead. As I walked toward my car, I noticed a strange feeling settling inside me. Not anger, not revenge, something steadier. Clarity. For the first time since Thomas passed away, I no longer felt like someone waiting for answers. I felt like someone approaching them. And somewhere ahead, waiting inside Benjamin Foster's office, was a clause that Thomas had carefully prepared long before anyone realized why. The day of the second meeting arrived with the kind of gray sky that seemed common in Ohio during spring. I left the house early, not because I was eager, but because I wanted a few extra minutes alone before everything changed. The drive to Benjamin Foster's office felt shorter than usual. Maybe because my mind was occupied. Maybe because I already sensed that whatever happened that day would shape the rest of my life. When I arrived, Ryan and Nicole were already there. Ryan stood near the reception desk checking his phone. Nicole sat with perfect posture, her designer handbag resting neatly beside her chair. Both looked confident. Neither noticed me immediately. As I walked closer, I overheard Nicole speaking quietly. Once everything is finalized, we can start making plans. Ryan nodded. The market is still strong. Timing matters. They stopped talking the moment they saw me. Nicole smiled. It was the same smile she had worn for weeks. Polite, controlled, empty. Good morning, Evelyn, she said. I returned the greeting and took a seat across the room. Nobody spoke after that. 20 minutes later, Benjamin appeared and escorted us into the conference room. The same polished table waited beneath the bright lights. The same pitcher of water sat in the center. But the atmosphere felt entirely different. Benjamin carried several folders. One of them was thicker than the others. Once everyone was seated, He folded his hands and looked around the room. "Thank you for returning," he said. "Today I will review the final provision that Thomas Carter personally instructed me to present separately." Ryan leaned forward slightly. Nicole's attention sharpened immediately. I remained still. Benjamin opened the thick folder. Several years ago, Thomas established a family trust. Most of the estate assets were transferred into that trust structure. Ryan frowned. "I thought everything was going directly through the estate." Benjamin shook his head. "No. The trust controls the majority of the assets." Nicole's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Benjamin continued reading. The house, investment accounts, savings, several properties. Everything sat within the trust. Then he reached the clause. The room seemed to grow quieter. "Under the terms of the trust," Benjamin said, "Evelyn Carter retains exclusive lifetime residential rights to the family home." Ryan blinked. Nicole stared at the document. Benjamin continued. "The property cannot be sold, transferred, refinanced, leveraged, or altered without Evelyn Carter's written authorization during her lifetime." Nobody spoke. Benjamin turned another page. "Furthermore, Thomas Carter included an additional protection clause." I felt my pulse quicken. Ryan shifted uneasily in his chair. "If any beneficiary attempts to pressure, manipulate, coerce, or improperly influence Evelyn Carter regarding housing, assets, financial decisions, or estate matters, that beneficiary's inheritance share shall immediately transfer to the Trust Preservation Fund." For a moment, absolute silence filled the room. Ryan looked confused. Nicole looked stunned. Benjamin calmly continued reading. "The determination of such conduct shall be made by the trustee based upon documented evidence, witness statements, written communications, or demonstrated patterns of behavior." Ryan finally spoke. "Wait a minute. What exactly does that mean?" Benjamin removed his glasses. "It means your father wanted your mother protected from outside pressure." Nicole's face lost color. "That is ridiculous," she said. "Nobody is pressuring anyone." Benjamin met her gaze calmly. "Thomas anticipated that possibility, which is why he included specific language." He slid copies of the document across the table. Ryan quickly began reading. The deeper he read, the more his expression changed. Surprise became concern. Concern became disbelief. Nicole grabbed her copy and scanned the pages. I noticed her hands tightening around the paper. For weeks, they had spoken about retirement communities, downsizing, future plans, property values. Suddenly, every one of those conversations carried consequences neither of them had anticipated. Benjamin turned toward me. "Evelyn, under the trust structure, you control all decisions concerning your residence. No deadline exists. No relocation requirement exists. No beneficiary may override your wishes." I simply nodded. Across the table, Ryan looked as though he had been handed an entirely different future from the one he expected. Nicole remained silent. For the first time since Thomas passed away, she seemed uncertain of what to say next. Benjamin closed the folder. "Thomas spent considerable time drafting this provision," he said quietly. "He wanted his intentions to be absolutely clear." I lowered my eyes toward the document resting before me. "Protect Evelyn first. Everything else comes second." The sentence from the notebook echoed in my mind. Suddenly it all made sense. Thomas had not created the clause because he distrusted me. He created it because he understood exactly what might happen after he was gone. And sitting there in that conference room, watching the confidence drain from Ryan and Nicole's faces, I realized my husband had seen the truth long before any of us were willing to admit it. The drive home from Benjamin Foster's office was silent. Not because nobody had anything to say, but because the truth had finally entered the room and left no place to hide. Ryan followed me out of the building and called my name before I reached my car. When I turned around, he looked different, less certain, less confident. For the first time in weeks, he looked like my son instead of someone trying to solve a financial problem. "Mom," he said, "can we talk?" I studied his face for a moment. "We just spent 2 hours talking," I replied gently. He lowered his eyes. "That is not what I mean." I nodded but said nothing more. Eventually he stepped back, and I drove away. That evening, the house felt different. Not because anything had changed physically. The same furniture remained in place. The same family photographs lined the walls. The same wind chime moved softly outside the kitchen window. Yet something invisible had shifted. For weeks, I had felt like a visitor waiting for permission to remain in my own life. That feeling was gone. Thomas had made sure of that. The next morning, my phone rang before breakfast. Nicole. I stared at her name on the screen before answering. Her voice sounded unusually warm. Evelyn, I was thinking about you. The sentence almost made me smile. For months, she had rarely called unless she needed something. Now suddenly she was thinking about me. That is kind of you, I said. A brief silence followed. Then she carefully changed the subject. Yesterday was unexpected. Yes, I replied. Another pause. Ryan took it pretty hard. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out across the backyard. I imagine he did. Nicole sighed softly. We never wanted things to become complicated. The statement hung in the air between us. Complicated. That was an interesting word. The situation had only become complicated because the outcome was no longer guaranteed. We spoke for a few more minutes before ending the call. As soon as I hung up, I realized something important. Neither Ryan nor Nicole had asked how I felt. Neither had mentioned Thomas. Neither had discussed his wishes. Their concern remained focused entirely on what the clause meant for them. 3 days later, Grace called. How did the meeting go? She asked. I told her everything. When I finished, she laughed softly. That sounds exactly like Thomas. What does? I asked, planning 5 steps ahead while everyone else is focused on the next 5 minutes. Her words brought back dozens of memories. Thomas preparing for winter before autumn ended. Thomas fixing problems before they became emergencies. Thomas quietly observing situations that others overlooked. The more I reflected on it, the more obvious it became. The clause was not an emotional reaction. It was the result of careful thought, careful observation, careful preparation. Later that week, Ryan stopped by unexpectedly. This time he came alone. He stood on the front porch holding a small box. Inside were several old photographs he had found while cleaning his garage. We sat at the kitchen table looking through them together. For a while, neither of us mentioned the trust. We talked about fishing trips, summer vacations, the time Thomas spent 3 weekends building Ryan a treehouse that leaned slightly to the left no matter how many times he tried to fix it. Gradually, the tension eased. Then Ryan picked up a photograph showing the 3 of us at a county fair nearly 20 years earlier. He stared at it for a long moment. Dad knew me better than anyone, he said quietly. I looked at him carefully. Yes, I answered. Ryan nodded slowly. Maybe that is what bothers me most. The room grew silent. Finally, he added, maybe he saw things about me that I refused to see myself. For the first time, I heard genuine honesty in his voice. Not defensiveness, not frustration, just honesty. And in that moment, I realized something else was beginning to collapse alongside their plans. The story Ryan had been telling himself. The belief that his father's decisions were unfair. The belief that the trust was a punishment. Deep down, he was beginning to understand what Thomas had actually been trying to protect. Not the money, not the house, me. And once that understanding arrived, everything else started to look very different. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere around our family changed in ways that were impossible to ignore. The urgency that had surrounded the house disappeared almost overnight. Nobody mentioned retirement communities anymore. Nobody left brochures on my table. Nobody casually discussed property values during dinner. The silence itself told a story. One Saturday afternoon, Grace visited my house for the first time since Thomas passed away. We sat on the back porch drinking iced tea while spring sunlight filtered through the trees. The garden was beginning to bloom again. Thomas always loved this season. He used to say that spring proved patience was worthwhile. As we talked, Grace shared details she had never mentioned before. There was one afternoon at the office, she said. Thomas came back from lunch unusually quiet. I listened carefully. That was not like him. Usually he returned with a joke or some story about traffic. But that day he sat in his office for nearly an hour without saying much. I remembered that expression. The thoughtful one. The one he wore when something important was weighing on his mind. Later he told me he had overheard a conversation completely by accident. Grace continued. He was meeting Ryan for lunch. Ryan arrived early. Thomas walked into the restaurant and heard part of a discussion before they realized he was there. My stomach tightened slightly. Grace looked down at her glass before continuing. He never repeated every word, but he told me enough. I remained silent. Ryan and Nicole were discussing future plans. The house, potential renovations, financing opportunities, property equity. They were speaking as though ownership was only a matter of time. The breeze moved softly through the yard. Somewhere nearby, a bird called from a tree branch. Ordinary sounds. Yet the meaning behind Grace's words settled heavily inside me. Thomas was hurt, she said quietly. Not because they discussed money. People discuss money all the time. He was hurt because nobody mentioned you. I closed my eyes briefly. Somehow that detail affected me more than anything else. Not greed. Not assumptions. The simple absence of concern. Grace continued. He told me something I never forgot. He said, if they can imagine the future without Evelyn while I am still alive, what happens after I am gone? For several moments, neither of us spoke. The answer now seemed obvious. Thomas had not created the clause out of suspicion. He created it out of observation. He watched carefully. He listened carefully. Then he acted carefully. Later that week, Benjamin Foster called. He wanted to review several trust documents with me and answer any remaining questions. During our meeting, he revealed another detail. Thomas had revised the language of the protection clause 3 separate times. Not because he changed his mind. Because he wanted absolute clarity. Your husband was remarkably specific, Benjamin said. He wanted no room for interpretation. Benjamin then showed me handwritten notes Thomas had attached during the drafting process. Most involved legal wording. But one sentence stood out immediately. Protection without punishment. Dignity without conflict. I stared at those words. That was Thomas. Even while protecting me, he was trying to preserve peace. He never wanted revenge. He never wanted humiliation. He simply wanted fairness. As I drove home that evening, I realized the final piece of the puzzle had finally fallen into place. For months, I had wondered whether Thomas anticipated what would happen. Now I knew the answer. He had not guessed. He had seen it. He had witnessed the assumptions, the expectations, the quiet calculations. And rather than confront anyone publicly, he chose a different path. A calmer path. A wiser path. He built a safeguard. One clause. A few paragraphs hidden within hundreds of pages of legal documents. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. Yet powerful enough to protect the person he loved most. When I arrived home, I walked slowly through the house. The evening sun cast long shadows across the hardwood floors. Photographs lined the hallway. Memories filled every room. For the first time since the funeral, I no longer felt confused about why Thomas had done what he did. The truth was simple. He knew exactly what mattered. Not the money. Not the property. Not the inheritance. He wanted to make sure that after 47 years together, nobody could erase my place in the life we had built side by side. 1 year later, I sat on the same back porch where Thomas and I had spent countless evenings together. The maple tree he planted cast a wide shadow across the yard. The flower beds were full again. Bright colors stretched along the fence line, and the garden looked healthier than it had in years. Life had not returned to what it was before his passing. Some losses never work that way. But life had found a new rhythm. A peaceful rhythm. The house remained exactly where it belonged. Not because of luck. Not because of a legal technicality. Because one man had cared enough to think ahead. During the months following the trust meeting, many things changed. Ryan and Nicole eventually stopped talking about moving me. They stopped discussing property values and future renovations. At first, there was distance between us. Awkward conversations. Long silences. Uncomfortable truths. But slowly, something else began to happen. Ryan started visiting more often. Not to discuss paperwork. Not to discuss assets. Just to visit. Sometimes we sat in the kitchen drinking coffee. Sometimes we worked in the garden. Sometimes we simply talked about Thomas. The conversations felt genuine again. One afternoon, Ryan admitted something I never expected to hear. Dad was right. He said quietly while helping me trim hedges. I looked at him, but said nothing. He stared across the yard before continuing. I spent so much time thinking about what came next that I forgot about what mattered right now. There was no defense in his voice. No excuses. Just honesty. I appreciated that more than he realized. Nicole changed too, although in a different way. The confidence she once carried around the estate slowly faded. Over time, she became less focused on appearances and more focused on relationships. She and I were never especially close, but we learned something important about one another. Respect can grow even after disappointment. It takes time. It takes humility, but it is possible. Grace remained one of my closest friends. We met regularly for coffee, and every now and then we laughed about how carefully Thomas had planned everything. One clause, she would say with a smile. Just one clause. And she was right. Hundreds of pages of legal documents existed within the trust. Yet one clause changed everything. Not because it transferred money, not because it punished anyone, because it revealed the truth. The clause forced everyone to stop and examine their priorities. It forced difficult conversations. It exposed assumptions that should never have existed. Most importantly, it protected the person Thomas promised to love all those years ago. One evening near the anniversary of his passing, I opened the small notebook I had found in his dresser. The pages were worn from being read so many times. As I turned through them, I found the sentence that had stayed with me from the beginning. Protect Evelyn first. Everything else comes second. I sat quietly for a long time holding that notebook in my hands. Then I walked through the house one room at a time. The living room where we watched movies together. The dining room where we celebrated holidays. The kitchen where we shared ordinary breakfasts that never seemed important until they became memories. Every corner of that home carried part of our story. And for the first time, I realized something. Thomas had never been trying to preserve a building. He was preserving dignity. He was preserving belonging. He was preserving the life we built together. As the sun set outside, golden light filled the room. I placed the notebook back on the shelf and looked out toward the backyard. The world was quiet, peaceful, exactly the way Thomas would have liked it. Ryan once believed an inheritance would shape his future. Nicole believed the same thing. In the end, neither money nor property changed their lives. What changed their lives was understanding. Understanding what family means. Understanding what responsibility means. Understanding that love is not measured by what you receive after someone is gone. It is measured by how you treat them while they are still here. And when I think back on everything that happened, I always return to the same truth. They thought the inheritance would change their future. In the end, one clause changed it instead. And when they finally understood that clause, the future they had counted on was gone forever.